two speakers with us. They will each give us a 35-minute talk. And after both presentations, there will be a joint Q&A session. Our first speaker, Tom Sorel, is Professor of Politics and Philosophy at the University of Warwick. He works in several areas of philosophy, but is best known for his writings in early modern philosophy and the historiography of philosophy. He has published extensively on Hobbes and Descartes, and a collection he edited with John Rogers on analytic philosophy and history of philosophy has provoked considerable discussion. He is previously on the editorial board of the British Journal for the History of Philosophy. In his talk, he will reconsider the tension between analytic philosophy and history of philosophy, and will ask whether it is possible to reconcile work on historical figures with philosophical problem solving. So, Tom Sorel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the organizers for going to all the trouble to invite me and having to cope with all of these presentations in English. I know that can't be an easy task. So I'm just going to read my text because that'll be simpler. Here we go. I'm going to speak today about tensions between analytic philosophy and the history of philosophy, and I'll give examples of how these tensions may be overcome. Analytic philosophy is the dominant style of philosophy in the English-speaking world and in Scandinavia, but it has growing numbers of practitioners in other countries. Even France and Germany, which traditionally have been centers of different kinds of self-consciously non-analytic philosophy, are beginning to adopt some of the methods of philosophy long familiar in the English-speaking world. The recent analytic turn in Europe is particularly noticeable in ethics and political philosophy. I don't know whether Turkey has been involved in this trend, but no doubt some of the participants in this meeting can tell me. By analytic philosophy, I mean an approach that often relates philosophical topics or questions to a special kind of analysis of the language that's used to talk about them. For example, the traditional philosophical question of whether anyone really knows anything is naturally understood to depend on what it is to know something, which in turn depends on how the predicate knows that contributes to the truth conditions of sentences with logical form A knows that P. In sentences of this form, A holds a place for a personal proper name, such as Tom, and values of P are sentences, such as Edinburgh is north of London, which are either true or false. To establish the contribution of knows that to sentences of the kind under investigation, philosophers have traditionally sought to state non-circular, necessary and sufficient conditions for A to know that P. If to know that P is to believe that P, for P to be true, and for A to have adequate justification for believing P, the question of whether anyone ever knows anything might be clarified by asking whether, for example, anyone ever has adequate justification for believing something. Conventionally, philosophers try to cut this question down to size by classifying truths, for example, by distinguishing knowledge of necessary truths and contingent truths, tensed truths, that's truths about the past and the present, general truths, and by classifying different sources of empirical belief, such as testimony, perception, and memory. As it happens, analytic philosophers have discovered over the last 40 years that it's very hard to give non-circular, necessary, and sufficient condition for the knows that predicate. But one result of trying to define or analyze this expression is to discover the many ways in which even a true belief can fail to amount to knowledge. A true belief, that's to say a belief that's true, a true belief fails to amount to knowledge when the justification for the belief is defeated by evidence that the believer might have acquired, or when the true belief is only accidentally true relative to how it was acquired. Now, the way in which different analyses of knowledge have emerged is by the discovery of different counterexamples to proposed analyses, that is, different examples in which, though someone has reasons for believing P, and P is true, ordinary users of knows that would be inclined to deny that the person in question knows that P. Linguistic intuitions, strong immediate reactions to how cases would be naturally described in English, are used to accept or reject an analysis. Now, this method of analyzing knowledge has the virtue of clarifying the content of epistemological skepticism. The more insight we have into the different ways in which beliefs can normally be inadequately justified, the more insight we can have into the conditions for not knowing things. For example, we know that people can fail to know things by being targets of misinformation. The greater the prevalence of misinformation, the more likely it is that we believe falsehoods, and the less likely it is that we believe truths. Even when we believe a truth in the presence of misinformation, it may be an accident that we believe that rather than a falsehood. In an era like the current one, in which there are campaigns of misinformation, our confidence that we know things must be less on empirical grounds as well as on general philosophical ones. But it may take a philosophical theory to make us understand the different ways in which different truths and sources of information can be variously subject to doubt. I've given the example of the analysis of knowledge to illustrate what is distinctive about the methods of analytic philosophy. Although philosophers from the distant past, Plato, for example, tried to define knowledge, many analytic papers proposing conditions for knowledge do not mention him or any other philosopher. They simply operate with definitions and examples intended to test those definitions against our linguistic intuitions. In this way, the analysis of knowledge in analytic philosophy is non-historical. It may even be anti-historical, since it may deny that past philosophers' claims about the definition of knowledge are relevant to defining knowledge. They may say that only the linguistic intuitions of competent users of knows that are relevant. It's striking that in analytic epistemology, even the problem of skepticism can be treated ahistorically. I invite people to visit the entry Skepticism in perhaps the best reference work in analytic philosophy, the online Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which I'll call SEP. Although it uses the terms Cartesian skepticism and Pyrrhonian skepticism, the content of the article shows no familiarity at all with Descartes' Meditations or with the catalogue of arguments in Sextus Empiricus. Not only does it show no familiarity, it happily uses the term Pyrrhonian skepticism, quote, with no claim to historical accuracy. In the SEP article, so-called Cartesian skepticism is, surprisingly, the paradoxical position that we ought to suspend judgment about a whole range of propositions while not suspending judgment about the intellectual policy of suspending judgment. In other important analytic writings on skepticism, for example, Peter Unger's book, Ignorance, Cartesian skepticism is understood as doubt whether a material world exists beyond the mind. The skepticism of Descartes' Meditation 1 is, of course, not confined to the external world. It's directed against the reality of mathematical entities, and to the extent that they are different from mathematical entities, what Descartes calls simple natures. But in any case, as I'm sure everyone here knows, Descartes is not a skeptic, but only a user of a method of doubt, which the figure of the omnipotent deceiver makes vivid. The whole point of the Meditations is to prove that there are limits to doubt, limits marked by the indubitable truth of the propositions, I am thinking, so I exist, and God exists. This observation is not a criticism of the article in SEP or of Unger's book, but at most a criticism of terminology that gratuitously associates positions that can be abstractly stated with the names of philosophers who never held them. It's not the criticism that the positions stated by Unger or SEP are not worth discussing or not philosophically interesting. I'm saying that mainstream writing by analytical philosophers is not only unhistorical, but casual about historical accuracy. I now turn to writing by philosophers in the Anglo-American tradition who work in what they call history of philosophy. Here, the writing is definitely about historical figures and usually consists of very well-informed and sophisticated exposition of the texts of those philosophers. Occasionally, this writing concerns schools of philosophy, for example, in the early modern period, Lockean and Cartesian groupings, or Epicureans and Stoics. Here, the typical aim is to interpret historical figures in ways that settle controversies about how they should be read. Readings that are more charitable and coherent are often preferred to those that attribute shallow confusions or mistakes to the philosophers in question. Sometimes a reading is arrived at of all of a philosopher's work or his principal writings, or if the philosopher is canonical, of a text that everyone studies. Sometimes an author will aim at facilitating the reading of a philosopher that students and other philosophers find very difficult, like Spinoza or Hegel. The audience for works like these is hardly ever the whole of the philosophical community or a large section of the philosophical community. It is nearly always other specialists in the writings of the historical figure in question. Anglo-American specialists in the first instance, but others if they are able to read English. In my experience, there is little interest in the English-speaking world in translating monographs by Anglo-American historians of philosophy into other languages, even when the figures being written about are French or German, say. Introductory books are the exception, especially if they are published in a series intended for the general or student reader. You may be interested to hear that at one very prestigious philosophy department in the USA, the department at Princeton University, there was once a controversy over whether students should be required to do courses on historical figures at all as part of their undergraduate degree course. Some of the philosophers in the Princeton department thought that courses in history of philosophy should not be required. They were not against offering these courses for those who wanted them, but they didn't think that these courses were necessary for people wanting to graduate with a philosophy degree or for those wanting to go further in the subject. To one of these Princeton philosophers, somebody called Gilbert Harman, the relation of history of philosophy to contemporary philosophy is like the relation of the history of physics to physics. Just as no one who studies physics in 2020 has read Newton, so it is possible to navigate the principal branches of 21st century philosophy, that's to say, epistemology, philosophy of science and metaphysics, moral philosophy, logic and philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of mind and action, with 20th or 21st century sources augmented by textbook summaries of what philosophers in preceding centuries have said. I've previously taken issue in print with Harman's position, and this is the book that I edited, which contains my article criticizing Harman. Especially in moral philosophy, where e.g. Kant's views often inform discussions of deontology, and Aristotle's are important to capability theory, as developed by Sen and Nussbaum, what historical figures actually said is important in contemporary philosophy. And there are live questions in metaphysics to do with the nature of causation that are still heavily influenced by Hume. Again, there's such a thing as the history of analytic philosophy itself, and the actual views of its founders, especially Russell, Frege, and Wittgenstein, are still of interest to people working in mainstream philosophical logic. This means that the division between history of philosophy and mainstream philosophy in the analytic tradition is not always maintained. And so Harman's advice, history of philosophy, just say no, is hard to follow even for analytic philosophers. So is there no problem in analytic philosophy about history of philosophy? I think there is a problem. It's that many of the people who work in history of philosophy, although they are trained in the techniques of analytic philosophy, do not fully exercise them. Although they work on problems in the interpretation of historical figures or movements, their work often loses touch with mainstream problem solving. Partly this is because of the tolerance in professional analytic philosophy of over-specialization, but I think it also proceeds from the fact that engaging in mainstream problem solving takes many historians of philosophy out of their comfort zone. Another relevant fact is that the combative nature of analytic philosophical discussion does not encourage people to engage and develop positions in areas of philosophy already occupied by specialists who are keen to demonstrate that newcomers are not competent to join in. Historians of philosophy trying to work in mainstream analytic philosophy then face the aggression of some analytic philosophy mainstreamers if they try to enlarge their range. But there are also tensions in the other direction. The mainstream analytic philosophy superstar, Bernard Williams, who's now dead, wrote what I consider to be an excellent book called Descartes, The Project of Pure Inquiry. This contains not only very sophisticated and largely correct exegesis of the Meditations and other writings of Descartes, but also the development of themes that connect Descartes with theories of objectivity and subjectivity discussed in mainstream philosophy, notably in the writings of Thomas Nagel. In particular, Williams associates Descartes with the ambition of achieving an absolute conception of reality. Whether or not that association has a basis in Descartes' texts, it is a conception of reality that is worth discussing in its own right, and that engages with the larger controversy over the relative merits of realism and anti-realism. It is notable, however, that Williams' book is little mentioned by specialist Descartes scholars. This raises the question of whether the division between mainstream analytic philosophy and history of philosophy is maintained by casual mutual neglect on both sides. A work that I first encountered in the 1970s directly and provocatively applied the methods of analytic philosophy to history of philosophy. This was Jonathan Bennett's book, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Central Themes. Bennett was a respected analytic philosopher, he's again also dead, who treated the writings of the three so-called empiricists as if they were contributions to the latest analytic journals. Selected parts of central works of Locke, Berkeley, and Hume were inspected by Bennett and systematically criticized, often after having been translated into explicit premises and conclusions in the style of the British philosophical journal Analysis. Most historians of philosophy writing in English think that Bennett's approach is extreme, but it is one of the only examples of a sort of attempted fusion of analytic philosophy and history of philosophy. Another attempt at softening the divide between analytic philosophy and the history of philosophy is visible in the Routledge book series that started in the 1970s and survives to this day. This is the Arguments of the Philosophers. This series was conceived by its editor, Ted Hondrick, as an attempt to present important figures in the history of Western philosophy by way of their arguments, as opposed to ideas in a history of ideas. Some of the early titles in the series cover some of the same figures as Bennett, but there are also forays into ancient philosophy and even some important French philosophers such as Sartre and German philosophers including Kant, Nietzsche, Hegel, and Schopenhauer. The treatments of writers in this series, that's the Arguments of the Philosophers, seem less focused and detailed, but at the same time more rounded than in Bennett. Nevertheless, they reflect the ambition of making the writers concerned more like contemporaries to be argued with than authorities to be deferred to. In other words, the series reflects one idea about how to make historical figures more available to analytic philosophy. Indeed, readings of historical figures that reflected 20th century philosophical preoccupations were encouraged by the series editor when he was commissioning books. And I should point out here that I contributed the book on Hobbes to this series long before I thought about historiography. I said before that historians of philosophy trained in analytic departments tend to be specialized. They write on history of philosophy and nothing else. Often they write about one philosopher or a few philosophers exclusively. They publish in specialist history of philosophy journals and would probably find it very hard to get articles accepted in Mind or Philosophical Review. This means that they get increasingly cut off from mainstream analytic philosophy and make little or no use of the training that they received in that subject. This produces the kind of specialization that makes it plausible to claim, as Harman does, that philosophy is one thing and history of philosophy another. In my own work, I have tried to use history of philosophy for mainstream philosophical purposes. For example, in a book called Scientism, Philosophy and the Infatuation with Science, which I wrote in 1991, I tried to show how Kant's view of the human faculties and the various branches of human learning is a good antidote to the excessive admiration for science that one often finds in naturalizing American philosophy. Kant's view is also an antidote to a kind of idealism implicit in denying that philosophy can be a mirror of nature. Or to put the point in a way that engages directly with the analytical philosophy that inspired the book, there are materials in Kant for a philosophical position about science that avoids the excesses of Quine on the one hand and Rorty on the other. The same materials are effective for avoiding the excesses of Rousseau's discourse on the arts and sciences and misappropriations of the idea of the two cultures in C.P. Snow. In the rest of this talk, I want to discuss at greater length a further example of how to bring philosophy and history of philosophy together, this time drawn from some work I've done on the moral and political philosophy of emergency. This is a picture of, a page from the Proceedings of the Aristotelian Society where I wrote this paper. So let me talk a little bit about emergency. Emergency is interesting for moral philosophy because on the surface, it seems to justify loosening or abandoning ordinary moral standards. Let us define emergency as a situation in which there is a high probability of serious harm or loss of life to an agent, and in which the opportunity to prevent the harm and loss is very short-lived, so that the agent has to act now, perhaps without much deliberation. It's widely agreed that in such situations, one is morally permitted and even required to break normal moral obligations. For example, if I am starving and injured and far from any help in the woods, and there is a locked cabin with some food in it, it's permissible to break into the cabin and take the food, even though it's wrong to break into property and wrong to steal. A more difficult example. Let's imagine that our planet is about to be hit by a large piece of space debris, and that this will bring an end to human civilization and much life on Earth. Suppose that there's nothing anyone can do to prevent it, but we have a few days before it takes place. Does that prospect mean that we can abandon some or many of our moral obligations and do what we like, especially get all the pleasure we can, since we're all about to die anyway? I think many of us would agree that we could permissibly stop worrying about paying off our credit card or mortgage, even though we have agreed to pay it. But the collision with the space debris would not suddenly free us from the obligation not to murder or rape or inflict pain gratuitously. In general, emergency does not relax moral standards. Instead, it reveals an order of priority in the goods protected by moral standards, such that some of those goods can outweigh others and permit the violation of the corresponding moral norms where they conflict. The goods of continued life and of being spared injury and attack are normally overriding, and other goods, such as the security of property, can sometimes be sacrificed for the sake of achieving the overriding goods where they conflict. What is more, in conditions where there is little time to think and act, as in cases of emergency, Some kinds of wrongdoing in response to emergency are excusable. But by the same token, it is morally highly important permanently to prevent emergency or limit its effects. This is true of emergencies that crop up within a single life, and even more so for public emergencies where institutions as well as individuals may have a role in prevention or mitigation. Now, the paper in which I discuss morality and emergency had no history of philosophy in it. It was written in 2003, by the way, long before COVID. So it had no history of philosophy in it. But when I started to consider the differences between private and public emergencies, and in particular the treatment of counterterrorism as a response to one kind of emergency, I thought of Hobbes's idea of civil war as the prototype of a public emergency, and his idea that the state emerges from a state of nature which confronts each person as a permanent emergency. I had previously worked extensively on Hobbes, and I thought that there were some ingredients in Hobbes of a good theory of public emergency response. In Emergencies and Politics, that's this book, I tried to show how, after revising Hobbes somewhat, one gets a surprisingly sensible approach to public emergencies in the form of civil war or recurring acts of large-scale terrorism. I contrast the revised Hobbesian doctrine, sober Hobbesianism, with unreconstructed Hobbesianism. Unreconstructed Hobbesianism is the theory Hobbes states in his political treatises. It's a theory in two parts. First, it's a theory of how people are morally permitted to behave if there is no state power. They are morally permitted to engage in a war against everyone, that is, behave ruthlessly and violently in self-defense. Then there is a theory of a certain kind of state as the antidote to the horrors of this war. Before the state exists, according to Hobbes, a mix of aggressive minority with a moderate majority exercising the right to self-defense leads to a general state of violence. The laws of nature tell us why and how we should leave the state of violence. There are two fundamental laws of nature: to seek peace to the extent others are willing to do so, and to seek peace by laying down rights. What Hobbes calls the right of nature is the right of each person in the state of nature, each person in the state of war, to be the judge of what is necessary for their survival and well-being. To form a commonwealth, a majority of a local population has to transfer this right, the right of nature, to a third party who thereupon becomes sovereign and decides for them all, through the laws he makes, what will keep them alive and allow them to be moderately prosperous. Transferring the right of nature takes away the conditions of war by, among other things, radically reducing the number of wills in charge of the survival of the many. One directing intelligence is better than many when there are so many people who are controlled by their passions. But this directing intelligence, which acts by laying down the law for the many, is itself constrained. Hobbes's Politics talks about the unlimited rights of sovereigns once the rest of the Commonwealth have submitted, but there are also duties of sovereigns, including the duty of keeping people safe from conquest, unfettered by unnecessary laws, treated more or less equally by the courts, and punished proportionately. The laws of nature mesh very well with these duties, and it is moral philosophy in the sense of a system of laws of nature that does more to unify the details of Hobbes' politics with his moral philosophy than moral philosophy as motions of the mind. So that's Hobbes. Now, what I call sober Hobbesianism, that's my revision of Hobbes, is unreconstructed Hobbes minus 3 exaggerations. First, Hobbes sets the threshold for war-provoking disagreement far too low. In his earliest political treatise, where sovereignty is connected with reducing many wills to one, he writes as if whenever practical judgment is distributed over more persons than one, it is plagued by indecision and perhaps even faction leading to war. The second exaggeration is to do with the permanent latency of all-out war in human nature and the supposition that it is just below the surface in the behavior of even a law-abiding citizenry. Hobbes often writes as if government is a permanent effort at stifling dispositions to conflict that are never eradicated. For example, he often implies that widespread public challenges to the sovereign power would immediately reinstate the war of all against all, with all its dangers, as if customs of civility and non-aggression developed in long periods between civil wars would instantly crumble. To uncover the third exaggeration, it is necessary to point out that Hobbes gives no eligibility conditions for the role of the third party who accepts to be sovereign in the original contract in the state of nature. Presumably, it could be anyone, yet it is essential for good sovereignty that the person who takes on that role identify with the interests of a whole people who submit to him. It's essential, that is, that the third party subordinate the interests of the individual he is to the interests of the many. But this generates a dilemma. Either detachment from one's own interests is possible for any individual naturally, in which case detachment, rather than unquestioning submission to a sovereign, may be the peacemaking measure par excellence, or else detachment is not naturally possible, in which case there is a big question begged when Hobbes asserts that the sovereign can and ought to forget himself in acting for the many. Hobbes wants to say that the normal inability of people to behave reflectively and to see their interests as only some among many is a cause of war, but, and here we come to the third exaggeration, he overstates the difficulty of achieving detachment and so implies that there are, after all, eligibility conditions for being the receiving third party in the mass transfer of the right of nature. I think the only way out of this dilemma for Hobbes is to concede that detachment is achievable, but difficult for individual human beings. But this opens the possibility of a democracy composed of those who are capable of detachment, a democracy with no need to transfer the right of nature. It also opens the possibility for each individual of telling real from apparent goods and of counting as real goods more than peace, including, e.g., the good of unaggressively leading one's own life. Crediting people with the ability to gain detachment, even about personal interests, sober Hobbesianism makes room for personal autonomy consistent with communal security. Well, I'm pretty close to the end now. More generally, and again contrary to unreconstructed Hobbesianism, only some disagreements are precursors of all-out war. Foremost among these are disagreements arising from what I call fundamentalist attachments. These are non-negotiable attachments to purposes or people or objects, attachments that people would rather be killed or kill for than lose. Even these have to become very widely distributed in a population credibly to provoke a war of all against all, but there are conceivable countercultural fundamentalist attachments that might attract such a backlash. As for the second exaggeration, that all-out war is permanently latent in human nature, sober Hobbesianism implies that the longer-lived stable government is, the less likely it is that subjects refrain from violence merely because they are forced to, and the less likely it is, consequently, that they will immediately revert to violence in a general emergency. Sober Hobbesianism gives weight to the transmission of practices of civility and is open to the establishment of institutions that inculcate those practices. Sober Hobbesianism, that is the theory that I'm constructing from Hobbes, from new materials, sober Hobbesianism is a variety of liberalism. It promotes the autonomy of self-critical pursuers of a variety of goods, so long as these goods do not endanger life. It assumes that citizens have reflective capacities and that they are not at the mercy of their strongest desires and aversions. It assumes that people can be moved by what is in anyone's interest and not only by what is good for themselves. But it also gives great weight to the protection of life and freedom from injury, and it calls for institutions designed to secure these things. In other words, it values security Sober Hobbesianism recalls the unreconstructed Hobbes, not in making security the organizing value of communal life, but in making security of life the overarching constraint on the organizing value, namely the exercise by anyone of autonomy. The three most important requirements of practical rationality from a sober Hobbesian point of view are: 1, the ability to detach oneself from one's appetites and ask whether there are reasons for satisfying them independently of the force of appetite or aversion; the ability to see one's own appetites and aversions as only some among others, distributed among all of the people one lives with; and 3, the ability to see that the satisfaction of appetites now or soon is not necessarily better than their satisfaction later. These abilities enable one to criticize and even weaken the associated appetites, and therefore to make decisions without being at the mercy of appetites. They can also make it possible to weaken the effect of appetite that conflicts with being law-abiding and aversion to doing what the law asks. In short, critical abilities in each person can make it possible for people to think about law in the impartial way that Hobbes associates with sovereignty. That completes my example of how to use history of philosophy for a project in analytic philosophy, in this case, analytic political philosophy. There are 4 elements in this approach. First, one needs a sense of the relevance of Hobbes to live questions in political philosophy about why public emergencies are to be prevented and what the means of preventing them are. Second, one needs a sense of the deficiencies of Hobbes' own answers to these questions. So one needs to read Hobbes critically. For example, his tendency to picture any kind of disagreement as a possible avenue to war or a case of war needs to be criticized. This much calls on the routine skills of an analytically trained historian of philosophy. The third element is an understanding of what positions in contemporary political philosophy are generally defensible. And finally, one needs to think out a way of amending Hobbes, changing Hobbes, revising Hobbes, so that the weaknesses of his position are resolved consistently with the assumptions of a generally defensible analytic political philosophy. It's the third and fourth elements that call upon the skills of an analytic political philosopher. To identify a generally acceptable political philosophy, one needs an understanding of the whole range of questions such a theory answers. Such a theory will tend to be consistent with liberal democracy, for example, but to apply to emergencies. It will also have to make room for temporary departures from liberal democracy. And it turns out that some concepts in Hobbes, his concept of good law, for example, are quite consistent with liberalism, even though Hobbes' unreconstructed theory as a whole is illiberal. But my own revision of Hobbes, what I call sober Hobbesianism, is liberal, democratic, and gives great weight to security, while also being intolerant of fundamentalist positions and actions inspired by fundamentalism. So it is a possible example of how to make analytic political philosophy and history of philosophy deeply complementary. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. As I mentioned at the beginning, we will have a Q&A session after the second talk. And if you have any questions, please write them. We only accept questions in writing. The second question will be in Turkish, so I'm now switching to Turkish. Evet, ikinci konuşmacımız Zeynep Savaşçın.
Our second speaker is Zeynep Savaşçın, and she is a professor in Galatasaray University in philosophy department. She works on Kant, Hegel, and critical theory and Hegelian philosophy and political philosophy. Articles are she has written about that, and she also compiled and translated some books about political philosophy. And now Professor Zeynep Savaşçın is going to talk about freedom in Hegel and Axel Honneth, who is the actor of history. The floor is yours, Professor.
Hello,
everyone. First of all, I would like to extend my thanks to every organizer in the symposium and to all attendees, of course. And it has been a wonderful event with the instruction and with the discussions. Thank you so much for that. I would like to also extend my thanks to their interpreters, especially in my position. I know that they have a hard job, and I hope I will not give you some difficult moments. First of all, I would like to start in my speech. Yes, I have an article written. It's only a draft, but that isn't a question I asked to myself. I am not, of course, not familiar. I am already familiar with Hegel, and he was my philosopher in my graduate studies. And I worked on him, but the question I asked to myself is a bit strange to me. It is a new thing for me, so I would like to share it. I would like to share this draft with you. It is not a closed definition or expression. Do not think it like that, but it is the questions, and I am trying to think with, and I hope we will shape it with the questions too, and I hope it will worth your time. So yes, I'm going to talk about in the framework of political philosophy. So in this field, we can also say that questioning the relationship of philosophy with its own history makes our work much easier. So I would like to state that I use the definition of political philosophy as broadly as possible without excluding moral philosophy. Marcel Gauchet is an important philosopher, a French one. In a speech in the text of political philosophy, he says, I translated it, and he says that the first aim of political philosophy is to make its own history. Why making our own history? When we ask it to Gauchet, he says that because thinking about our political and social existence will always involve understanding the past that we have left behind, or continued in some way from understanding the point we have reached today. So actually, the relationship of political philosophy with its own history, like philosophy in general, includes both a detachment and continuity relationship, and both dynamics are included here. But according to Gauchet, however, thinking about the meaning of sociality and the self-interpretation of social existence requires that correct analysis of these dynamics of detachment and continuity. So when we turn to the two thinkers I will discuss, to Hegel and Honneth, on the one hand, there's a thought that lies at the base of the tradition of critical theory, but on the other hand, the thought of Honneth, the last representative of Frankfurt School. So we will stay within a tradition, and I will talk within this tradition, even if this tradition goes through conflicting pathways. But so one may think that thinking within a tradition in this way, maybe it will not tell us anything or teach us anything about the relationship of philosophy with its own history. But I think it's important to see the decisive role of analyzing the continuity and detachment relations that we mentioned when staying in this tradition. It's important. So Honneth himself defines his connection to Hegel's thought, particularly in his work published in 2001 called Suffering from Interminacy, or we can translate it like that. He says that this connection is actually re-updating of Hegel's philosophy of love. He has an effort like that to make Hegel's philosophy of love a current contemporary one. So therefore, the issue here is not only an effort to understand the origins and source of thought, but also the effort of critically renew this source. So that is the effort to re-update its elements that still stand for today's theory, to make it a more contemporary, current one. And of course, there are other efforts of examples to update this the tradition of critical theory. For example, we can see it in Habib, Ben Habib, for example. She plays a central role. The concept of ethical life, Schittlichkeit, plays a central role in the thought of Sheila Ben Habib. However, unlike Ben Habib, for the early works of Hegel's, the ethical life, the critical role of ethical life concept in the understanding of ethical life, we encounter it in the earlier works, and examples of this relationship about the sociality and relationship is going forward in his thought. So when it returns to Hegel's thought, there are other richnesses actually. This actually, on the other hand, to go back to Hegel, to update Hegel, all these efforts are expressed within the out of the framework of the critical theory too. For example, at the last quarter of our century, for example, the place opened for communitarian and multicultural theories have also reconsidered Hegel's recognition. On the other hand, this diversity and richness, of course, goes beyond, we have gone beyond Hegel's thought in many respects. It doesn't change this fact. This is expressed in all these efforts to update him, of course, especially at the point of post-metaphysical word about the philosophy of spirit for us today, how unacceptable it is. But however, despite this break, the word of the philosopher opens up a horizon that we can still take part in today. So in order to understand this horizon a little, first I would like to pose a question to Hegel's thinking and then Honneth's thinking, and starting from the points. The question is in the title, who is the subject of the history? I formulated it again. However, with your permission, I both replacing the concept of subject with actor in the sense of the agent, and asking the question, can philosophy be the actor of history? Because, yes, it is the title, we can write it down in the title we can want, but I have actually fallen into a trap of philosophy. Actually, I prefer the actor because in Hegel, although spirit is actually exactly the subject of history, but the question of the role of human as the actor of history in the movement of spirit is another question. And as the Hegel, the one who interpret and comment on Hegel are mostly asking this question. So I would like to ask this question this time as the action of philosophy. It is the heroic themes, for example. I will not talk about that. I will try to do it like that without mentioning the hero connections in his. So we know that in his last work, namely the Principles of Philosophy of Law, a theme of conflict traverses in Hegel's thought. This is the conflict between law and love. On the one hand, there are traditions, habits, and lifestyles that determine the social existence of human beings, and on the other hand, the laws that are outside of this, which impose themselves on this field from the outside in the work. Phenomenology of spirit, these phases, as we know that the decisive turning point of this conflict in spirit chapters, Hegel will talk about it, later call it about the objective spirit, and he's talking about the phases of this conflict between law and life. And actually, in other words, this is the historical adventure of thought until it feels at home again, until it makes the word on its own. He talks about the historical adventure. So it is the spirit making the word its own, recognizing its own action in history, and law and life mutually recognizing each other. So the concept, this recognition, refers it to in its broader sense. However, the phenomenology of spirit doesn't include a reflection on the sociality in which this recognition takes place, that is, on the objective spirit and ethical life. Yes, he talks about ethical life, but it doesn't talk about the moment which this definition realized. In other words, the historical moments discussed in this work, that is, the ethical lifestyles, are the moments that lead towards ethical life, where recognition will take place concretely, which is the moments that lead towards ethical life. This date goes to ancient Greek side, to the French Revolution. But interestingly, however, the spirit division do not close with French Revolution. The interesting thing is that a stage of this objective spirit, a phase of an objective spirit do not close with an historical moment. This chapter doesn't close with a historical moment. The last section before moving on to religion section and to absolute knowledge is titled as morality. So here, this is the morality. So here, moralitat, actually. Here, we realize that Hegel actually has allocated a privileged space for Kant's moral understanding, with which Hegel advanced by reckoning with himself from the very beginning. And of course, Hegel's only reference is not Kant's philosophy, but throughout, at the end of this chapter, a recognition takes place. And when we look at the size of this recognition, we see that the conflict between law and life corresponds to the opposition between judging consciousness and acting consciousness. So before moving on to the absolute figures, the things goes between judging consciousness and acting consciousness. Before moving on to the absolute spirit, so Hegel considers the Kantian duality, the division of the subject between moral law and action based on his own reason. And similarly, actually, in the principles of the philosophy of life, before passing to the ethical life, this time the morality section takes place before it. However, I would like to suggest that this transition in the phenomenology of spirit has another meaning. I'm trying to say that here, in this chapter, Kant's understanding of freedom is criticized on the one hand for the dualism it causes and its consequences, but on the other hand, it is presented as a moment of objective spirit in the development of spirit. Therefore, this understanding of freedom almost has the status of an ethical lifestyle. It both deprives itself the possibility of realizing itself in a concrete sense with a contentless moral love, and it is a stage of almost as if it had the power to express the spirit of an era, the sociality of that period. Here, in Hegel thought, I think we can catch a clue as to how philosophy can be one of the actors of history. And of course, in Kant's philosophy, I thought that there is a clue we can catch here. Of course, throughout the entire spirit section, not only lifestyles and social situations are not discussed in successive historical moments, but also the word of thought that accompanies them. But however, here we can still see that modern understanding of freedom based on Kant's philosophy marks a privileged turning point in Hegel. There is a duality, double exit from here. This turning point carries us, on the one hand, to what Hegel would call an absolute knowledge, on the recognition, the judging consciousness, and the performing consciousness. And in terms of political philosophy, this means that sociality will only be a throughout sociality that we can thought on it, we can think on it, that we will talk about a law that will not take place outside individuals, but will express their own life words. So this second axis is actually which makes the individual and society agrees to a consensus. Again, it is an ethical life theory. So here we see actually, it makes sense here that Hegel places the Kantian conceptions of freedom as the final stage in the evolution of the objective spirit. So here it actually points a brand new ethical life to Kant's philosophy. Now, perhaps maybe I have said something that should have been said at the beginning, in fact, but Hegel, in the principle of philosophy of right, explicitly rejects any role of making history or predicting history of philosophy. I think we all remember the famous quotation, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, he says. So we will make it a meaning afterwards. So philosophy is only there to make sense of what happened. It tasks the task of revealing the unity of the rational and the actual one. So Hegel actually doing this in the principles of philosophy of right. It lays out the rational structures of the modern state, and the social, it is actually therefore not a purely theoretical ethical life construct. This is the main reason why critical theory is based on Hegelian legacy. But I still think we can ask, after, does this situation completely take away the possibility of possibility to be one of the actors of history? I would like to continue this question by providing some clarity, albeit limited, to the concept of actor, by giving some clarity on the concept. In this book titled Making History, Christophe Bouton examines the role of human action in history from a very broad perspective. I will benefit from his book in this speech. And it examines arguments that both affirm and oppose such a possibility throughout the history of philosophy. And at the beginning of the book, he says for the proposition that it's people who make history, since there is no provable truth, we can only think of it as it having the status of a principle. So what this principle will correspond to, where we can understand it. At the end of the book, Bouton proposes, where he shapes his thought, that instead of making history, he puts the responsibility here. So he opens the actor category, the one who takes responsibility with its acts, actually, and reformulate it. So thus he reformulates the category of acting as taking responsibility through actions in the history. So if we go back to the principles of the philosophy of law, we said that the role Hegel assigned to philosophy is a reconstruction, as Jean-François Kervaguen and Axel Hegel using this concept. I am taking it from them. So reconstruction of concrete realization frameworks, the rational. So here we can think that the act of thought is a two-way or two-stage act of taking responsibility, I think. So primarily, in the sense of clarifying the rationality in the historical development of this social, in this restructuring. On the other hand, and maybe pointing to a more specific responsibility, in the sense of revealing the inadequacy of the existing recognition frameworks that put this rationality into practice, and the conditions that they have difficulty in. So we know that the second stage of Hegel, we actually, it is most clearly expressed at the concept of populace. What is it actually? The organization of civil society is formed by individuals who cannot find a place in solidarity networks based on work in this sense, so that members who lack the recognition they deserve. So it is, they lack this recognition, and it includes it. This community includes it. So here, of course, the populace concept of Hegel and the actor and the role of philosophy here, how these conditions regarding populace will change. We know that Hegel refers change to world history at the end of Principles of Philosophy of Law. However, we can see here that thought refers to pathology created by existent sociality, that it refers to the part that is outside the frameworks of recognition and that doesn't have the means to realize individual freedom. And with this, we can say that he actually takes a responsibility in terms of noticing the direction that change should follow and makes us to be aware of that. But I have specifically used this concept of pathology because actually it is not a one that Hegel will use, but Axel Honneth will use it. Then, before moving on to Honneth, I want to make 2 points. I want to underline 2 points. First of all, in Hegel, of course, the analysis of the pathologies of ethical life extends to an entire objective reading of the spirit, that is, from the ancient Greek to the French Revolution. And so, it is not limited to the concept of populace. This reading is not limited with it. But, however, the historical moment that allows all this analysis or understanding this, the analysis of the pathologies is the historical moment is actually understanding of freedom of Kant, actually. However, the opportunity to go back and read history as a history of liberation grows. Populace, on the other hand, is the pathology of real life that realizes ethical life, that realizes individual freedom within the structures of social freedom. Secondly,
the fact that Hegel reads history as the action of tin is not of spirit is not something to put aside easily, because it is constructing as intersubjective perspective, and Sheila Ben Habib has also followed this inter-subject perspective. In such an intersubjective perspective, we can understand what I am looking for in the history of love or in the phenomenology of spirit. In any case, I think to read Hegel's philosophy by following the trace of intersubjective is a main component of the connection created by the critical theory with its own history. Where from this came to Hegel, I think we can discuss this under 3 topics. First, Honneth describes the theory as a normative social theory. And this is actually putting forward the normative core. There is a normative core in this philosophy, but he actually follows a restructuring work in the meaning of to reveal the moment of sociality in the institutionalized structures. Of course, with the philosophy of society, he's not only relying upon the Hegelian legacy, but he's positing it in a much wider tradition, which starts with Rousseau. This philosophy of society is the theory of sociality where the individual creates the conditions for realizing itself within the framework of the social institutions and the intersubjective relations. Therefore, he thinks that this question of justice is being invited toward to the concept of sustaining a good life. And this is Honneth's and Ben Habib's objections against Habamasu's communication and ethical theory. And we said that is starting from the society itself. And according to Honneth, the experiences of injustices are important within the society. And he's trying to conceptualize the implicit expectations in these experiences. This was the first point. Now we can go to the second aspect of its relation with Hegel's philosophy, where the subjects are experiencing humiliation, degradation, devaluation, and he reformulates these experiences within the framework of the concept of recognition, because this humiliation, degradation, devaluation is being experienced before the agencies. And recognition is the intersubjective condition that individuals can realize their personal targets in an autonomous way. In determining these intersubjective conditions, the framework drawn by Hegel in his philosophy of law is still valid, according to Honneth. And this is the third point with regards to its connection with Hegel. Of course, it's not only about content, but from conceptual perspective, he is following the triad made by Hegel in the ethical life. We would remember that Hegel divides the ethical life into family, civil society, and state, three domains, the triad, and he described this triad as the determinations of the freedom in the intersubjective relations through these agents, these institutions. So these are collective structures of freedom. Honneth is carrying these three domains into his philosophy. In each domain, namely family, civil society, and state, but of course, state will mean something else, framework of the solidarity relations. In each domain, the positive relations between an individual and the others also determines the relation between the individual and himself or herself. The affection-based family relations gives the self-confidence, and to have the equal rights with the others within a legal order is the condition of self-respect. And third area, which is called solidarity relations by Honneth, when the individual contributes to sustaining the common life and reproduction of the joint life, and if this contribution is recognized, the individual will feel valuable. Here, of course, we have to emphasize something as the respect in the legal area and value of self in the solidarity area. In the former one, what's important is the relation between different individuals. But in the latter one, individual expects to be valued for itself. So in these social pathologies, the fact that individual cannot construct these conditions, which are the conditions of self-realization, is revealed by not being able to be included by any or one of the social structures of social freedom. So when we look at updating the recognition in the philosophy of society, Honneth actually describes this by getting beyond Hegel through Hegel. Of course, this connection with Hegel does not exclude a rupture, a break. Actually, this is a break from the philosophy of spirit, or philosophy of mind, Geist, being mind or spirit in this translation. It is not the critical, is not based on a rationality which is carried by the history of critic, but it is concretized within the society. It is actionalized through rationality. So it is mediating the relation between the philosophy and history. Honneth, despite all differentiations and differences, thinks that this is the joint meaning area of the critical theory. This is his main principle. These social rationalities which had gained actuality are sometimes impeded, and these moments are revealing itself as social pathologies. What differs Honneth from Habermas is this. One of the important premise of the diagnosis of this pathology is the following: the social interaction should not be only limited to a linguistic communication. It should be going beyond the consensus. It is in one sense surplus, in one sense missing, because in one sense it is not content with the question of justice, because it includes the understanding for good life, the framework which will make possible that individuals realize themselves and widens towards the actions for producing joint life or common life within solidarity. But on the other hand, it is missing. It lacks something because it is more limited in comparison to the communicational ethics, and it is pointing out to a less determinant universal. Honneth does not make a differentiation between the social transformation and the universal, because the continuous transformation of reconciliation is the basic element of this society. Here, actually, conflict is not something which should be ended with a reconciliation. As it were, it is the instrument for the social integration. When it took over the struggle of recognition from Hegel and says that in different states of socialization, and thanks to this socialization, we learn new qualities which exist in the other objects through our observations and rational evaluations, and this increases the normativity in our relations of recognition, which means that any value recognized in other people opens the way for a wider autonomy. I will be concluding soon. I tried to share them with very basic topics. Now I will ask the same question to Hegel. When theory moves from rationality inherent to the society, what does it mean that philosophy is an actor of the history? Does it have a different meaning than what we have recognized in Hegel? Here, what's important is the role of revealing, especially revealing the social pathologies within a conceptual framework, whereas Honneth's self-recognition is important because he makes a differentiation from the ideological ways of the recognition and the other search for recognition in the contemporary political theory. And on the other hand, it is exposition of under which conditions the subjects will reveal their experiences of injustice. But actually, this is not something small. Theory actually should turn back to the practice from where it was born. What Honneth says is the following: theory should always think about its pre-science birth out of an experience and its usage in a praxis in the future. Here, theory is not only something excluded by the social order, it points out to the direction of the development. And finally, let me end with saying, when we go from the intersubjective perspective to intersubjectivity, intersubjective perspective of the Geist to the intersubjectivity, we see that both human action and the philosophical thoughts, action, responsibility gains a new understanding. I'm aware of a new question opening, which I could not discuss here, but this is a draft because I expect your contributions in order to continue to think on this. And this way it will give me an idea. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you very much. Now we will be proceeding with the questions and answers. While you were speaking, Tom Sorel, there were already a few questions directed to Tom Sorel. So I would like to start with this.
Okay, so Professor Sorel, the first question is for you. It is from Güven Güzeldere, and I'm reading. I very much agree with Professor Sorel that the treatment of history of philosophy in mainstream Anglo-American analytic philosophy is problematic. I frankly do not understand the willful indifference, if not ignorance, of my colleagues vis-a-vis the historical background of the problems they are engaged in, and I hope it is not simply out of laziness. In this context, I cannot find, in particular, what is the difference between philosophy and science, such that history of philosophy is not only useful and necessary to the contemporary philosopher, but that it must be a part of the philosophy curriculum, in a way that history of physics, though I think is useful to the training of contemporary physicists, is not as urgently necessary for modern physics curricula.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that even I think it's complicated to answer this question. Many analytic philosophers, but not all, admire science. I think if we had to come up with the difference between American philosophy and British philosophy, we would be talking about maybe a difference in how much science is admired. In America, it is huge, science. In British philosophy, it is less huge, I think, though there are some people who are very enthusiastic about science there too. What's the difference going to be between philosophy and science on an analytic philosophy's view of things? Well, there's still going to be quite a lot of difference, because a lot of mainstream analytic philosophy is to do with linguistic analysis. It's to do with logical and linguistic analysis, that is, treating a lot of language as having a logical structure that is captured in first-order logic. That's a propositional calculus and predicate calculus, and also the analysis of concepts, as I gave the example of knowledge. So conceptual analysis is not going to be like science. There's no measurement. There's no confrontation of proposals with empirical reality. So there's still quite a big divide between science and philosophy. Very, very recently in analytic philosophy, there is a tendency called experimental philosophy. And experimental philosophy consists of conducting analysis of concepts with a much wider group of people than has been used in the past. Not just philosophers and philosophy students, but loads and loads and loads of people are asked what their intuitions are in relation to many cases that are constructed in philosophy. And the results that you get from taking a wider sample of intuitions is different from traditional philosophy. Now, I'm very skeptical about the value of experimental philosophy. So I have a fight both with Quine and with the experimental philosophers, some of whom are more sympathetic to conceptual analysis than others. But either way, it's very, very difficult for experimental philosophy to explain why what it does is philosophy. And also, if you bring in empirical data, why philosophers have to do it? Why not bring in a psychologist or a sociologist? There's no reason for a philosopher to do it. They're pretty bad at it, actually. So I think however you look at this, the division between science and philosophy is going to be important. But if I can just say one other thing, you'll notice I am not defending history of philosophy at the expense of analytic philosophy. If I have to look in the mirror and say, what am I? I am an analytic philosopher. And I'm trying to get other people who are trained as I am to be able to do more than one thing in philosophy, to be able to look at the value of history of philosophy and to be able to look at the value of analytic philosophy. I don't want to say that analytic philosophy is bankrupt. On the contrary, I think it's a super. The body of work that's been created in the English-speaking world is super. It's just a bit. It's just a bit divided up. That's all.
Thank you. And before moving to the second question, I would also like to say something about the question you raised at the beginning, the state of analytic philosophy in Turkey. And actually, in Turkey, the term analytic philosophy is used quite synonymous with philosophy of science and language, logic. Right. So something where you have many symbols and you do deductions, and almost never it is used in the sense that analytic political philosophy of analytic philosophy of art. So that's my observation at least. So, okay, I'm proceeding to the second question, again to Professor Sorel. It is by Emrah Günok. From the point of view of analytic philosophy, referring to the history of philosophy would be tantamount to mentioning something like history of logic. Is history of logic possible? Or is it just the subjects of logical thinking who can be acknowledged to be the objects of historical thought? Does aiming at an absolute and ahistorical knowledge exclude the fact that the process of scrutiny, which is not exempt from the human mistakes, is a historical process? Is history the history of mistakes only?
Well, I think there's a lot of there are a lot of issues raised in that question. Maybe I could start with the last of them. You know, is history, say the history of philosophy, for example, just the history of mistakes? Clearly not. Clearly not. There are many especially in analytic philosophy. There are many agreed achievements and results in analytic philosophy. So not everything is regarded as a mistake. For example, Russell's theory of descriptions, which is a method of analyzing sentences that begin with VF, that method of analysis is regarded as an extremely important achievement in philosophy of logic, and the way that it gets to it is considered very important. Similarly, there are important results from Frege. There are important results from people other than Russell, like Kripke, for example, in our own day, or David Lewis. These may be philosophers you've never heard of, but many of these philosophers are regarded as having achieved definite results. When we look at the history of philosophy too, it isn't the case that everything is regarded as a mistake. For example, I mentioned a particular approach to contemporary political philosophy, which is associated with the economist Amartya Sen and the philosopher Martha Nussbaum. And Martha Nussbaum is a trained Aristotle scholar. I don't myself agree very much with Martha Nussbaum, but she has popularized this kind of combination of development economics with Aristotle, and that is an influential position in contemporary analytic political philosophy. So there, she doesn't revise Aristotle very much. She really just uses Aristotle as it exists for these purposes. And there are other philosophers who use Kant this way. Maybe Christine Korsgaard at Harvard does. Again, that's not an approach I agree with very much, but it's there. So it's not the case that history of philosophy is all a matter of mistakes. And you know, to underline what I'm trying to say, I don't want to reject history. I don't want to reject analytic philosophy. I don't want to be overcritical of the way that it regards history of philosophy. I want people to do both, like I do, to put it that way.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question for you, but it is written in Turkish, so I'll read it in Turkish and leave the translation to professionals. Anlattıklarınız ışığında,
under the light of what you have told, according to you, can we think that the contemporary political problem is the protection of the existing democracy, for example, to think about the measures against the otherization mechanisms, but does not this approach mean to sacrifice politics to security?
Yes, that's a very good question. That's a very good question. When one looks at the philosophy of emergency, where emergency takes the form of terrorism, let's say, you often get this problem. So when we look at the counterterrorism that came after 9/11 in America, and the emergency legislation that has been introduced to cope with terrorism in both the US and the UK, for example, much more freedom is given to surveillance agencies and security agencies than previously. The criticism of that tendency, though, comes from liberal democratic philosophy. Sometimes I think it also comes with a kind of casualness about security, as if this is a made-up problem, as if it's an artificial problem that doesn't really exist. I don't myself agree with that. I think security is a serious problem, and so is the problem of maintaining democracy. You know, we've just passed through a health emergency as opposed to a terrorist emergency over the last couple of years. And many people, for example, in the Netherlands this morning, in Belgium yesterday, are protesting violently about being locked down for their own good, for a public safety purpose. That tension between democracy and security, including health security, is real. And I don't think that people who are doing liberal political philosophy are trying to erase security or erase liberty. They're trying to reconcile them. And it's for this purpose that I wanted to use Hobbes, because Hobbes, if you read him carefully, has some liberal elements in him and many others that are illiberal, but there are ways of getting from his text to something that actually works for a liberal democracy. That's the kind of point that I was making. The reason that Hobbes is particularly good is because he does take security seriously, maybe over seriously, and most of liberal democratic philosophy does not. So that's a good fusion, if you see what I mean, of Hobbes with the philosophy of emergency.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions for either of the speakers, of course? Okay. Evet, Zeynep Hocam, Şükrü Argın'ın size bir sorusu var. Hegel söz konusu olduğuna göre
Professor Zeynep, Şükrü Argın asks, thinking of the Marxist famous sentence on changing the world, what can we select between being a cautious owl and a cock which is singing early in the morning? Actually, Hegel already answered this in the Principles of Philosophy of Law. Introduction is very important, I think, in that text, because there are tips related to relation between philosophy and history. That's where we understand this. I think phenomenology of spirit is not actually telling us this so good. Yes, a cautious owl. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't say anything. It's not about shaping or directing the future. But but also ethical life is losing its strength. And if you can see the dispute or the conflict within it, if philosophy can reveal this conflict, it can show a direction too. Which relations, which agencies, what to do. Maybe not this, but still. It can point to the missing puzzle to change, but not more than this in Hegel, at least in the principle of philosophy of law. I don't know if I could answer your question. Özgür Soysal has a question. Habamasu has a paper from Kant to Hegel and then back from there. Under what you have told, Honneth is also turning his face to Hegel in understanding his story and conceiving the history as a basis of the critical theory. I wonder, is there a way finding an efficient dialogue between this source approach and the approach that we should leave alone the normative basis and we should give up from looking at them? What would you think about this? I'm not sure whether I have understood the second part from Kant to Hegel, then back to Kant. Actually, the relation between Kant and Hegel, this will be a very single-sided Kant reading, but still, if we are to reconstruct that dialogue, I think this will be very productive in terms of the issues discussed by the philosophy of politics. It can teach us a lot. We are to learn many things after, as a result of this dialogue. I think these two axes are feeding one another. What I try to say is the following. It's an important time, end of 20th century, liberalism and multiculturalism gained an important role in the philosophy of politics. But we have seen that the sides of this discussion are also trying to construct dialogues with, are not constructing dialogues only with Kant or Hegel, but also they are trying to construct some cross relations, how to put it. For example, multiculturalist theories approaching to liberalism, just as the case in Taylor, or liberal theories are approaching to multicultural theories. In this very point, we can see the cross-cutting between Hegel and Kant. And I think this is a rich area, still a rich area. I'm not sure if this was the question, because the second part was not very understandable for me.
So I would like to read it again. So actually, with these approaches, is there a possibility to find a fruitful dialogue between the contemporary approaches where the actors of the history are not important, or searching the normative foundations? I don't know which theories you are referring to, but Honneth also tried to make his own theory to be not to be a normative one. So, for giving up about the heroes of the history, yes, it takes us to that field, of course, because it is a perspective within the agent. So the sociality, its own institutions within this dynamic It tries to make it forward, to move it forward in a more completed, why we say it in the completed way. In Honneth, it's very clear. The meaning of completedness is important, to have the conditions of realizing the individual himself or herself in the best possible way, to prepare the ground for these conditions. So therefore, the way to do this about not to say about what is the normative foundation of it, but to follow the pathology, or to analyze the pathology here. He means it like that, with a diagnostic approach. And here, actually, he continuously looks to the society as the spirit of Hegel is sitting within the history, and we look to it, to look it into the eyes. So we look into the eyes of the society. So how does this defined struggles mean to us, actually? Thank you so much. We have a last, maybe there is a question to Mr. Sorel by Şükrü Argan. With the counter myth or the urgency you had said before, is it possible about continuing be moral in the urgent situation? Can you expand it more?
Sure. Yes. What I was saying is that in emergency situations, certain kinds of moral values become more important, overriding than others. And for example, if we reflect on COVID, for example, in the UK and elsewhere, there's been a tension between maintaining privacy and saving life, if you see what I mean. So in the UK, for example, we spent an enormous amount of money on creating an app, a piece of technology that would track where people were without revealing their identities. And that was for the sake of privacy. I think that was horrendously stupid in a public health emergency for two reasons. First of all, because when people finally report as having got COVID, they have to talk about a lot of intimate information, like where they've been and whom they've seen anyway. That's one thing. But the other is privacy, in my opinion, is very unimportant related compared to the saving of life. So look at what the South Koreans did with COVID. When the South Koreans started tracking and tracing, they used all kinds of data sets that are illegal in Europe to put together. For example, they looked at data sets of people going and depositing cash in cash machines to discover where they were and where they might have been infected. They used other data sets that would normally never be allowed to be used for tracking location. Now, is that a privacy violation? Of course, it is a privacy violation. But why is privacy being violated? It is being violated to save lives. Should privacy be sacrificed to save lives? Of course, because life is much more important than privacy where the two conflict. They don't, of course, always conflict where governments say they do, but the difference between saving life and saving privacy is very clear. So what I'm saying in an emergency is, in the case of emergencies, the need to save life, the need to protect people against injury becomes more important than the need to protect privacy. It's not that those things are no longer important, like privacy is no longer important, but it's a lot less important in an emergency than other things. That's what I'm saying. So if we go back to the difficult example of our being on Earth, and we know that a big comet or a meteor is going to hit Earth and we'll all die, what are we entitled to do then? Well, I think we are entitled to stop paying our credit cards. And I think we are entitled to stop paying our mortgages. We are not entitled to rape people. We are not entitled to do other things that may give us pleasure. But how we make that division is another matter. So I think that's a very interesting question, whether in certain kinds of emergency, everything becomes permitted. My view is not everything becomes permitted, but showing that is difficult. It's a sophisticated problem in the ethics and politics of emergency. I hope that helps to answer the question.
Thank you very much. And so we are ending this third session of the symposium. And in 20 minutes time, there will be another session. Hope to see you there also. I would like to end by saying thank you to both our speakers. Thank you for your talks.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Teşekkürler. Biz de çok teşekkür ederiz. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Zeynep hocam.
We would like to extend our thanks to all speakers too. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, and thanks to the interpreters again.
Evet, gerçekten.
Gerçekten olağanüstüler. Olağanüstüler.
They're amazing. And now we are ending the session, but our last session start about 20 minutes. So we expect you all the next session.
Thank you all.
Thank
Thank you very much for participating. Thanks.